What do you get when you combine a daring hijacking with a culture of mistrust in our government and 50 years' time? Well, you get one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century and a myth that may last for hundreds of years to come. Welcome back to No Alter Egos. Let's doc about it. I am Trll Kennedy, your host. We're back here for another week of exciting talk. This week we're wrapping up with episodes 3 and 4 of Netflix's docu-series DB Cooper, Where Are You?, detailing and documenting the progress in the investigation into the mystery of the hijacking that took place on November 24th, 1971, when a man who simply gave the name Dan Cooper, now known as DB Cooper, hijacked Northwest Airlines Flight 305 and jumped out with over $200,000 and not a passenger or crew member harmed in the incident. We, of course, talked about it last week, episodes 1 and 2, which not only documented the hijacking itself, but then delved into some of the suspects, including a lead suspect in Robert Rackstraw, who Tom Colbert and his team investigated for well over a decade. Well, episodes 3 and 4 really continue into not only Rackstraw, but some other potential suspects, as well as some greater themes that we're going to get ready to discuss. But before we do, for anyone that is new, welcome to the No Alter Egos podcast. I'm Trll Kennedy. We host this every week on WHPB 98.5 The Wire FM here in Orlando, Florida. There's also a simultaneous broadcast on WUVS 103.7 The Beat in Muskegon, Michigan. This is from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. If you missed that show, there's also a Tuesday 3 p.m. rebroadcast on WVBH LP Power 105.3 in Benton Harbor, Michigan. If you miss any of the radio shows that are live, or if you just want to catch up with the show, period, or watch it on demand, each new episode becomes available Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our YouTube channel, the No Alter Egos podcast. It's also available on the Umoja Radio app, and it will be coming soon to your favorite podcasting platform near you. You can find me on Instagram at Trll Kennedy with no I, so just TRLLKENNEDY, or on TikTok at TRLL_Kennedy. And you can find the show at No Alter Egos Podcast on both Instagram and Facebook, and the No Alter Egos Podcast on YouTube. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you are watching this on YouTube, or even if you're listening in, go check out the YouTube channel. We're a growing community, excited to have new listeners and viewers in every single day. And one of the things that I'm really excited to get into is the continuation of this story, because so many people are unaware of the impact that this has had on culture. There are people who may not even know about the DB Cooper story, and we're going to explore not just these episodes of the documentary and close things out, but some of the themes that they really go over. I think it's really important to understand the context that the story took place in, especially when the hijacking first occurred, and even to now, and how it's really trickled and filtered down through the years through American folklore, and why it has been able to do that in general. But yeah, just want to welcome everyone in. As I said, this is the No Alter Egos podcast. And what you're actually catching, whether you're listening or viewing this on YouTube, is Let's Doc About It. It's the mini-series by this podcast. It's where I talk about some of the most intriguing documentaries that are out there right now, whether they're on Netflix, Hulu, YouTube, whatever the case may be. But I love finding interesting new documentaries and bringing them to you guys. As I stated earlier, we started last week with DB Cooper, Where Are You? This is part 2 of that, where we cover episodes 3 and 4. And it's just really interesting, a bit of background on this series. So the DB Cooper mystery, of course, we talked about what happened last week. This gentleman, he went onto a plane in 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, dressed neatly in this suit and tie with some shades on, smoking his cigarettes, and a briefcase that apparently, according to him, had a bomb in it. He then proceeded to hijack the plane, having all the passengers safely unloaded before having $200,000 that he was requested, along with 4 parachutes, brought in. And on the way back, as the plane was flying from Portland or Seattle airport back to Reno, he jumped out a little bit between the Oregon and Washington state line in this area called the Dark Divide with the $200,000 in cash and parachute, and has not been found since. And the enduring myth of this has really spawned its own culture over the last half century, because no one has, as of yet, been found or discovered to be DB Cooper. So let's get into things. Of course, we're continuing this week. We talked about, as I said, episodes 1 and 2 last week, just detailing Rob Rackstraw as one of the prime suspects, as well as what actually happened in the hijacking itself. And episodes 3 and 4 really continue into some fascinating areas. And we're going to get to that right now, coming up here on Let's Doc About It by No Alter Egos. So let's talk about some of the more prevalent themes that not only this entire docu-series, but especially and specifically episodes 3 and 4 really explore and dig into before we even get into the synopsis, because the themes really do help to provide greater context for this entire story and mystery. Theme number 1 that especially episode 3 dives into is how the culture of the internet and really human culture on a larger basis lends itself into transforming even extraordinary moments which are really in and of themselves very almost unbelievable, but it takes and transforms them into enduring myths. In fact, that is one of the theories about human culture and how it has come to evolve and come to be, really got started, is the fact that the myths that we create around the stories of human existence is what has lent itself to the evolution of our intelligence as a species and how we have managed to create culture and art, culturally significant items that pass on the thought processes and modalities by which we all live our lives. And that's one of those really important things that I think this documentary explores, is the culture of myth making, how it is that we are so in tune with telling stories about ourselves that when you have a story like this about this man that does something seemingly so daring and incredible and gets away with it, that especially because there is no culprit that has been officially declared as having been the guy that, that did it, we create this larger myth around it. And especially in the age of the internet that we live in right now, where information is passed along that much quicker. It's called the telephone game. If you think about it, the telephone game that we all used to play in class, where you can start with one message at one side of the room, and by the time it gets to the other side of the room, it's something completely different than the original message. But it's that on steroids times several billion, because you have a bunch of people who can put their own perspectives onto things. And so that large theme of the internet especially, but human culture on a larger basis, really being prone to myth making and turning the extraordinary into the infinite, into this mythological kind of just really larger picture of our story as humanity. DB Cooper is no longer just some guy that got away with a hijacking. He is the modern day Robin Hood without having given back anything to the poor. It's just that he was able to stick it to an authority structure that so many people are mistrustful of. And I think that's one of those really important themes that not just in this story, but for a lot of stories, it's really cool for us to explore that angle, how the internet has really allowed for us as a species to make our own myths in real time and much faster than in years past, where it would take generations for a story to become myth and passed down. We can make myths instantaneously in the age of the internet. And so that's one of those big themes that gets explored in episodes 3 and 4, how we really have taken the time to transform this one man and his act into this larger than life subculture, which has spawned conventions. The town nearby where he is purported to have done the jump has its own bars and restaurants, and these hijacker and skydiving themed, everything from mugs to shirts and keychains. There's all sorts of paraphernalia now associated with this skyjacking, and especially now in this modern day and age where information gets passed instantaneously between us on our cell phones, it's become even more larger than life than it already was. Another theme that gets explored is how our biases tend to really color the way that we view the world, but not just the world, but even events. I would dare say that if this were a black man that had done this, he probably would have been caught. And you know what? I wouldn't even say have been caught. I don't even know that they would have brought the money on board. They would have just stormed the plane after he got everyone off. They wouldn't have given him the chance to be so calm and collected. I don't know that he would be remembered as fondly. Let's say that all other things being true and consistent, he managed to do exactly the same thing that this guy Dan Cooper or DB Cooper managed to do. I don't know that he gets remembered in American mythology the same way. John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and Machine Gun Kelly and all these guys that we look back at in American history as these gangsters, black gangsters or purported criminals and things like that, they're not remembered so fondly. In fact, they're remembered as just being criminals. They're seen kind of as almost like scum. It's not given the same mythos that non-black or white male characters are given. And that's another angle to see how the biases of people, especially in a society that is dominated mostly by white men, how this white man who did this act of criminality and hurt no one in the commission of it, maybe psychologically scarred a couple of the stewardesses, but generally, like, the passengers of the plane didn't even know it was being hijacked. And so he is remembered with far more fondness and far greater fondness than maybe if he was non-white, or especially if he was a black man. And more than just coloring the way that we view the lens in the story of this white guy that was dressed in business attire, neat and trim, that pulled off, the greatest caper of the 20th century, we think about the fact that even the flight attendants and the way that they viewed him and interacted with him, the people that were sitting next to him, Mr. Bill Mitchell, and their memories of the event can be colored by the fact that this was a man that looked very much like themselves. Bill Mitchell, very much like him, just an older version of himself, if you will. And extrapolating even further out from this D.B. Cooper story, we have to understand that biases, they're going to color the way that we view an event. They always say that there's three sides to an event: party A, party B, and then God, or the overarching truth of the matter. Because at the end of the day, people's personal experiences, their memories, and the values on which they're raised are also going to color the way in which they perceive something. So it's not just about literal vantage point and point of view, but there's literally the psychological processes and the life events and experiences that are going to shape and color the way that we perceive everyday happenings in life. That's an inescapable fact, is that every single minute and every single moment of our lives is shaped by the bias of our perspective, a perspective which is influenced by so many outside factors. It'd be difficult to enumerate them all, but I can say that even looking back into that event and how it is remembered now on a larger cultural basis, that the cultural bias of tendency towards likability for white men, even in acts of criminality, it affects his hero status. D.B. Cooper is a hero to many people instead of a criminal. He is seen as someone who successfully stuck it to the man. And cultural biases being taken into account, we can say with a great degree of confidence that maybe and probably with a high degree of certainty it wouldn't be the same if he was a black man that tried to pull off that stunt. So we have to take a look at the biases surrounding how we even remember this man and the mythology that has been born from this stunt that he pulled off all those years ago. And then a third theme is relating kind of to the second theme, that our cognitive biases or our confirmation biases can sometimes tend to skew us away from the truth. It can tend to color facts as we observe them. So it's not just our biases of perspective, but our cognitive bias. When we so badly want something to be true that instead of searching for objective facts, even if they contradict with our preconceived notions, we in turn look for facts, as they were, to confirm those biases. Why it's called confirmation biases. So we look for evidence that reassures and supports the conclusions that have already been drawn up, whether at a conscious or subconscious level in our own minds. And that's a third major theme that really gets explored throughout this entire docu-series, but really hits home very hard in episodes 3 and 4 as they begin to explore a very obscure, at least here in the United States, French-Canadian comic by Albert Weinberg that is named The Adventures of Dan Cooper, and how that little-known comic here in the States may have inspired someone of Canadian descent, or even here in the Americas or in America, to actually pull off this caper and stunt. So I think in terms of the themes of this documentary, we're going to see as we go through the synopsis that it comes kind of back and forth to this confluence of factors, the internet and all these amateur sleuths having a chance to take a look at this case. Tom Colbert and his bias as a white man, but not only his bias as a white man, but his confirmation bias as an investigator, the amount of time and money that he poured into this case and how it may have led him down the path of Robert Rackstraw to where even if it can be demonstrably proven, he is going to go to his grave should there not be someone else found and definitively proven to be so. He's going to go to his grave thinking, or at least in his heart, knowing that Robert Rackstraw is and was D.B. Cooper, this guy. And then the greater cultural bias of how, as a white man that pulled this off, he is remembered as a hero instead of as a criminal. He's not looked at as someone, and granted, there are several factors that influence that, including the fact that he didn't physically harm anyone in the commission of this crime. He may have psychologically harmed the stewardesses and the crew of the aircraft as he pulled it off, but in truth, he didn't physically, rough them up and do all this. He was just very matter of fact about it. At least that is how it's purported. But let's get into things and talk about how this one extraordinary event on that November day all those years ago really has turned into something so much greater than itself, and what it could mean even for the future of this myth, of this legend we now know to be as D.B. Cooper. So episode 3 starts out with Tom Colbert and his investigative team. Obviously, the end of episode 2 was kind of painting some pretty strong conclusions about the potential and possible guilt of Robert Rackstraw in all this and how he was more likely than not D.B. Cooper. But episode 3 starts out with them pitching the show to the History Channel, and in fact, successfully doing so. He got the History Channel to buy the documentary, which, after pouring in several $100,000 of his own money and years of his time and the stress of it all, he actually was able to find some kind of fruition in it, in that the History Channel bought the doc and was like, yeah, we see the evidence you have, let's go with it and see what conclusions can be drawn. It then goes on to say, however, that after 6 months, the deal begins to fall apart. And in just episode 2 of History Channel's special on the D.B. Cooper case, the key flight attendant witness, Tina Mucklow, having looked at several pictures of Robert Rackstraw from back then, goes on to say definitively, no, that's not him. That's not the guy that I had to sit next to. And that's not the guy that ended up hijacking Northwest Airlines Flight 305 back in 1971. And that pokes the biggest of holes in the case of Tom Colbert and his team, because we have to understand that the entirety of their investigation is centered around the fact that there are all these bits and pieces of evidence that purportedly point to Robert Rackstraw as having been D.B. Cooper, as having been the guy that pulled this caper off. So for the key eyewitness to look at several very good pictures of him and say definitively, no, that's not him, clearly their case has been torn to shreds. I will, however, at this point say that eyewitness testimony, I'm not going to say is unreliable, but you can ask any prosecutor or any investigator. They will tell you that even near to the time of events and circumstances, eyewitness testimony is only about 50% reliable, much less for an eyewitness to be almost 50 years removed from a situation to remember details that clearly is going to be an almost impossible task. I'll tell you this, I consider myself an intelligent person. And if you were to ask me about a significant event, for example, I remember where I was when September 11th happened. But the older I get, those details, which were so vivid and clear to me, even in the initial years after the event took place, after 9/11 took place, they're not as clear. So you're asking a person who may be of maybe just average intelligence or even above average intelligence, but to remember someone's face very clearly 50 years later, unless it was maybe the case of a rape or a killing or something like that, where there's a vivid image burned. And even then it can't be relied on to be perfect. But I can't say that Tina Mucklow saying that, this wasn't the guy. I don't think that can be taken on its face as definitive proof that Robert Rackstraw was not, in fact, D.B. Cooper. I will say this, I personally don't think that he was, but it's hard for me to say that a supposed eyewitness after a half century still remembers every detail about that day so clearly that they're going to be able to definitively rule someone out based on a set of pictures. At any rate, moving on, even though they had these 93, I believe was at the point in time where they had sold the doc to History Channel, they had 93 pieces of evidence that purported that Rackstraw was in fact D.B. Cooper. But at the end of it all, History Channel ended up essentially almost discrediting him. And one of the hardest things to accept about it is that even though they had these 93 pieces of evidence, they're all circumstantial. There is no direct evidence linking Robert Rackstraw not only to the hijacking itself, but to even having been in Portland, Oregon on the day of the hijacking in question. And so the end of the History Channel documentary essentially discredits Rackstraw and sees the FBI essentially dropping the case and saying that we're not going to dedicate any more resources to trying to find this out. Now, what that essentially means is that it's dead in the water again. And Colbert and its team can't accept that. They go on to say and accuse the FBI of being in cahoots or collaborating with the CIA. Of course, in our previous episode, I mentioned that it was purported that Rackstraw had connections to the CIA, both in Nicaragua during the Iran-Contra scandal, as well as in Iran during the overthrow of the Shah. There's several places and locations where he's known to have been in doing some purported work for the CIA, but that's really not been confirmed heavily at this point. But what they were claiming is that the FBI was attempting to cover up the information. So they filed a FOIA lawsuit, a Freedom of Information Act request lawsuit against the FBI. And even though it took a while, they eventually got a judge to side with them. And there was a giant document dump done by the FBI. So I believe it's over 25,000 pages of information that were made available to the public that was then cataloged and eventually released on this website by Colbert and his team, where they start to go through and show everyone everything from letters to newspaper clippings to different reports and call-ins and all the suspects that they had been combing through and why they may or may not have been, what eventually led to some of the suspects being ruled out by the FBI and vice versa. There was just all this information that immediately became available to the public. And with it, this online community really began to grow and hone in. Like the document dump, for those who were they already had a bit of a fervor about the case. Now millions of people could really jump in and begin to start sleuthing online. All these subreddits opened that were essentially trying to go through all of the pieces of evidence and everything that had been seen, because there were a bunch of letters that were also supposedly sent out by Cooper, although many of them have been debunked by this point. But there were letters that were sent out to various news outlets and stations and newspapers saying, this is why I did it. And there was supposedly some hidden code. So that's the next angle that this documentary begins to jump into, is the angle of the hidden code in these letters once this treasure trove of information has been released to the public after the FOIA lawsuit. So the story of this code really starts with the story of Mr. Colbert and how at the age of 11 in 1970, during the Rose Bowl game between Michigan and USC, he had this near-death experience. Ended up in a coma for a little while, actually, and he was a small kid. And when his parents thought he was going to die, he miraculously recovered. And it was after that he began to question his purpose in life, and that led him into his career as a news reporter, an investigative reporter. And that has kind of colored his lens of life ever since then. And it jumps into the story about how after the History Channel ends its search, they begin to try and find other outlets and ways to get the story out. So he ends up contacting Tim Evans of the Indianapolis Star and saying, I have this crazy bit of information about the D.B. Cooper case that I think you would want. In fact, he had so much. Evans characterized their interaction. He said, usually sources, are reticent. They're hesitant to give you information. But with Colbert, it was like trying to drink water from a fire hose. He was just throwing piece after piece after piece at you, really trying to get the story out there. In fact, he concluded, and probably truthfully so, that he wasn't the only person that they had contacted. Even if Colbert was following up and being aggressive about it, he knew that they were trying to get the story out there into as many places as possible. And so this guy, this reporter, Tim Evans, begins to do some research of his own, including calling up Rackstraw and asking him point blank, are you D.B. Cooper? Let's just get it out there so that we can debunk this. In fact, he says that he offered him 4 different times in their taped phone conversation, which plays on the documentary, that, he offered him these 4 opportunities. Are you D.B. Cooper? And in every single case, he never denied it, leading Evans to believe that Rackstraw was kind of in on things a little bit, maybe not working fully in cahoots with Colbert, but in on it in the sense that it provided him with a bit of notoriety, and he could act as though he didn't want it. But if he wanted to go away, he could just flat out deny it and say, please let me move on. But he kind of just dangled things along, kept this air of mystery around things, if you will. And so there's this gentleman that comes on in the middle of this search that is purported to have found and broken a code contained in one of the letters. In fact, a couple of the letters that were sent supposedly by D.B. Cooper in the aftermath of this hijacking. You know, he writes these letters speaking about how he did it because he only has 14 months to live and how he wants it to be one of his final acts of vengeance against the government, essentially. Even in this other letter writing, you know, I'm using everything that Uncle taught me, more than likely a reference to Uncle Sam. But at the end of it, he has kind of this saying, you can tell those cops that, you know, my name is not Dan Cooper. And there's kind of this numerology that he uses to crack the code, essentially saying that because the letters tell those, whether it's like lame cops or something like that, but tell those cops, he takes that section of it and the numbers from the letters in the alphabet add up to the number 269. And if you put in the name Robert Rackstraw and then the shortening for his position in the Army, which was a lieutenant, and then the contraction of the word I am, so I am LT Robert Rackstraw, that apparently also adds up to 269. And so it was seen as like this aha moment. You know, he spoke about the fact that using the same kind of code breaking, you would get that because they had these 7 C's, there were 3. 3 is the number of the letter C in the alphabet. So you had these 7 C's above the Washington Post, which is one of the letters that he sent off. It was addressed to the Post. But he had these 7 C's and he had these other codes contained in there, this number that said 717171684, and how it essentially stood for the 331st Division of the Army Security Agency, and how that's the division that Rackstraw really wanted to be a part of and ended up joining in Vietnam for about 6 months before he ended up leaving. But I got to be honest with you, it felt like a bunch of conjecture. Even the explanation that I just gave you, if you hear how convoluted it all sounds, that's because it did come off, at least to me, as a bit convoluted. At the end of the day, this guy doesn't have to talk in these codes, but you know, even if he did, you can say anything and match it up to anything using that code breaking system. You can take it, you know, I think one guy came on and said, I'm SpongeBob SquarePants, and it would add up to the 269 as well from that one particular phrase that he was using to say that I'm Robert Rackstraw or I'm Lieutenant Robert Rackstraw. It's just too vague. And that's one of those things where we talk about confirmation bias, really coloring the lens through which you view something, so that even a code breaker who's looking to break a code, he's framing it through the lens of this one particular suspect, and then using that lens to color in the details of like, oh, this number and this number must match up, so it must be true. But the hole that can be poked in his logic is that it can be true of almost anything. You know, anagrams are anagrams because you can rearrange the letters to mean anything. And moreover, when you talk about using coded numerology like that to try and draw a conclusion about something based on the way the numbers add up, you can make any phrase add up to almost any other phrase using the right combination of words and letters. And so for me, that was not the strongest argument to be made in regard to that. But the code breaker did purport to claim that these codes and these letters showed definitively that Robert Rackstraw, using Army and CIA training, had coded into these letters that he was, in fact, D.B. Cooper, and he was laughing in everyone's face while he did it. But the truth is far more complicated than that. And as episode 3 kind of winds down, we really begin to see how confirmation bias and even cultural bias can really color people in the wrong direction, almost, as we further explore this enduring mystery of D.B. Cooper here on Let's Doc About It by No Alter Egos. So we can already see and observe how confirmation bias has not only affected the investigation by Tom Colbert and his team, but how even in the age of the internet, everyone's confirmation biases are not playing into things to the point where even a seasoned code breaker, because he's trying to look through the lens of Robert Rackstraw, can take a simple code, and even if he's managed to crack a little bit of it, make it so convoluted as to really discredit his findings to a large degree, at least in my opinion, once again, this just goes back to that thing where you can make anything look like anything if we're talking numerology and numbers and putting phrases together to mean, one or multiple things. It's not the most accurate way to try and portray things, and it could also be the most genius way because of the fact that so many different conclusions can be drawn. Maybe he really did say, I'm Lieutenant Robert Rackstraw in that message. And because it can be interpreted so many different ways, it'll never really, truly, and fully be discovered and found out. But as the documentary progresses, at least episode 3, we then jump into this next angle as this gentleman named Wally is talking to Russ and Kim Cooper. No relation to Dan Cooper or DB Cooper. But they were calling this story about how this guy claims that it was actually a 4-man job. So he actually claims that he and 3 gentlemen actually met up with Cooper. So what he says is that Cooper jumps out of the plane with the parachute, the money, and the bomb in the briefcase and lands safely near this airfield. They then pick him up in a pickup truck and fly a short distance to another airfield where they fly over this lake called Vancouver Lake, and they dump $50,000 of the money as well as the bomb into the lake to create a false trail for investigators to think that maybe Cooper had landed and died on impact in that lake or something to that effect. At any rate, they dump the money and the bomb, land at this other airstrip where Cooper then changes clothes, flies back out and lands near Portland International Airport, goes to Portland International Airport, and buys a ticket to Las Vegas, where he boards the flight with no issues and flies to Las Vegas, essentially scotch-free. The rest of the group takes the remaining $150,000 as well as the parachute, and they bury it in a certain and specific location. So this is Kim and Russ Cooper relaying the story to Tom Colbert and his team. And this, once again, ties into that confirmation bias theme, which is that they drive all the way out to this purported site with metal detectors and a whole team of individuals, and they find some nylon cloth that's woven together. And they bring it to the FBI saying, hey, we found the parachute. They have no way of knowing it. They just think it could be a parachute, and they latch onto it. And Tom Colbert's confirmation bias is so strong that he goes on to Fox News to say, yeah, we found the parachute and we sent it off to the FBI, and they haven't said anything. But all they found, this is videotaped evidence. They have it on video of their discovery that they made. It's a dirty old piece of cloth in a field in the middle of nowhere that they purportedly buried this thing and this money, the parachute and this money. And I began to feel bad for the guy because you realize someone can pour so much of themselves into an endeavor that they begin to lose the plot. They begin to not see reality for what it is. And at the end of the day, I personally don't think that nylon cloth meant anything, nor does the FBI. I think they're trying to move on from the embarrassment of the case because it is just going to be one of those unsolved cases. But at the end of episode 3, going into episode 4, we're alerted to one new twist in the case, if you will. And that's this little known French comic called Dan Cooper, The Adventures of Dan Cooper. And so episode 4, entitled Cooperland, kicks off with this whole spiel and this real dive into this comic book character, Dan Cooper, who was little known here in the United States of America, but was well known in French Canada. He was a French-Canadian comic book hero of sorts who was a member of the Royal Air Force and went on these adventures where he would fly the newest jets and parachute out of them. It's even speculated that there are certain strips of the comic that may have inspired this character, Dan Cooper, or DB Cooper as he's now known, directly, where it's showing him skydiving over certain locales and locations. And so Albert Weinberg, this guy that created the comic, because of the success of the comic, especially in regards to how it helped improve recruiting into the Canadian Royal Air Force, the French Canadian Royal Air Force, he was given access to these Air Force bases, but because, and especially in the wake of the hijacking in 1971, he was very reclusive when it came to doing interviews or answering questions from reporters about the possible connection between his comic, Dan Cooper, and the Dan Cooper that eventually hijacked Northwest Airlines or Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 successfully. But one of those things that is not really discussed so much, but is an interesting angle, is the fact that this guy, Dan Cooper, not only shares the same name, but has these mannerisms that are seemingly similar to the Dan Cooper that hijacked that flight all those years ago. It really paints this picture of a Royal Air Force in decline in Canada. And so the character Dan Cooper actually was really helpful to them. But it also pointed to the fact that maybe it's a guy that ended up back in Canada that pulled off this hijacking. And what do I mean by that? Well, apparently the 50s were a time of great prosperity for the Canadian Air Force. They were up to date with the latest military technology. They had the love and adoration of the Canadian people, and they were really highly respected. However, going into the 60s and even the early 70s, there was a period of great decline where over 500 pilots were released, essentially just thrown back into civilian life with no kind of parachute, pun not intended, but no kind of safety net or parachute. They were just fired unceremoniously and said, you have to go back into civilian life. And so a lot of them were disgruntled. And that's why I said this hero, this action hero, Dan Cooper from this French-Canadian comic, he may have inspired a guy who was vengeful against just the military order worldwide and saw an opportunity, especially with lax airport security, to pull this off. But who knows? That's once again just one of the other angles that can be explored. And that is one of the crazier things that goes back into that initial theme that we talked about, which is that in the age of the internet, myth making and culture creation around events happens instantaneously. And because it's the internet and there's so many people that have access to it, it happens in far greater numbers. It's not just, it's not just contained to one corner of the world anymore. It's now global. It is really now this global phenomenon where so many people have taken an interest in the story and in the legend, if you will, of D.B. Cooper, which has just grown in its mythological status as more time passes and there is no defined or definitive suspect that we can pin it on. In fact, another clue sparks and sets off another feeding frenzy of the minds, if you will, when it's discovered that the clip-on tie, which is one of the few pieces of evidence that was left behind by Cooper in the commission of this crime. It was a clip-on tie and some cigarette butts, which would have, in today's day and age, almost certainly would have proven at least who the guy was, because we could look up the DNA and see if it's on record or if it's a match for one of these ancestry databases. But the tie that was left behind, unfortunately, those cigarette butts were lost or destroyed by the FBI. And so they no longer exist, or the evidence itself no longer exists. But the tie that was left behind by this guy was an interesting bit of evidence in that it contained commercially pure titanium alongside other rare earth metals that are only really known and seen in the aviation industry. And so there were a bunch of people that began to speculate even more so that, yes, this was a person that had a history maybe working for Boeing or in some kind of aviation factory because of the fact that this tie had these materials on there. And there's a balanced expert that's kept in there. I say balanced only because she offers a counterpoint, but she is a former CIA agent, if you will. She actually worked with their espionage program to help with disguising agents. And so she said this would have been a perfect counter-espionage move. It would have been for that tie to not even be his. Just got it off a guy to help, once again, paint these false clues and false trails. But that's really what the bulk of episode 4 explores. It also goes into the sad and unfortunate fact. Well, maybe I'm not going to say sad and unfortunate, because there was a point in this guy's life where he was really into some heavy criminal activity. But Robert Rackstraw is now dead. He died a few years ago, it looks like. And maybe with him dies the last real hope of finding out who D.B. Cooper is. But let's jump back into this theme of how culture is spawned, because that's one of the big themes that gets explored over this final episode. Eric Eulis, he's this guy that has founded CooperCon. This was back in 2018 when the first CooperCon was held. But a ton of people have shown up for this event where they go and they discuss amongst each other their theories about who this guy is, where Bill Mitchell is a bit of a celebrity because, he was sitting on the plane next to this guy. And it's just crazy to think about the fact that this entire culture has been spawned from this one event and made even grander, greater, and more crazy now in the age of the internet. we now have that luxury that they didn't have to communicate with each other in these ways. And yeah, CooperCon is officially a thing. It's officially a thing now where people go every single year. And from CooperCon, new theories have emerged. But I thought one of the more interesting theories was definitely that concept of this French Canadian action hero, Dan Cooper, having the literal same name as the guy that purchased this ticket. And it probably was a false name given, but there's a very strong possibility that he was thinking of, or at least inspired by, that character. Now, am I going to go as far as to say it was someone from the French Canadian Air Force or the Royal French Canadian Air Force? No, I won't go that far. But I will say that it's a fascinating angle to consider, and one that I hope that you've been considering, because this has been, at least this documentary, has been another fascinating reminder of the fact that myths are these human vehicles which pass on some of our values throughout time. And some of the values that we can scrape from this whole myth and legend of D.B. Cooper is the fact that we are okay with rogue and criminal behavior if several factors come into account and play. One, if the guy looks the right way, which in American culture, as a white male, neatly dressed, he kind of fits this cultural and societal ideal in a culture dominated by white men. It's this weird thing where even though he commits this criminal act, he's not seen in the eyes of many, and I mean by many people, as a criminal, first and foremost because of his archetype, who he is as a person, his physical phenotype, and the archetype that represents in his society. Next is the fact that he didn't harm a person physically in the commission of his act of criminality. So because the passengers on the plane weren't even stirred into a panic, they were blissfully unaware that the plane was being hijacked, even as it was being hijacked. That was another thing that led to this really immense and really profound respect passed down by people towards this guy, because yeah, you were able to commit this crime and you didn't harm anyone in the commission of the crime. And then third is the fact that the guy has never been found. And so all these things, him never being found, it just adds that next mind-blowing mythological layer to things. And all of these really come together to influence the cultural lens and myth by which this character, Dan Cooper, now known as D.B. Cooper, thanks to those reporters who misreported his name. But this myth of D.B. Cooper is now larger than life because it was the right guy in the right place at the right time, committing the right kind of crime under the right circumstances, not harming anyone in the commission of that crime, and getting away with it scot-free and never having been caught, never being caught in all these years after the crime has been committed. That is what leads to this enduring pathos of this myth that now lives on and that has found a new home on the Netflix docu-series D.B. Cooper, Where Are You?, which wraps up reassuring what is the only staunch truth from this whole thing, which is that no one has as of yet been found or discovered to definitively be D.B. Cooper. And that will continue to live on now for generations to come. Because with the death of Robert Rackstraw, with the death of many others, for all we know, D.B. Cooper could have died back in the 90s. In fact, if he is still alive, he would be a guy who is, according to the descriptions that was given, a guy in his mid-40s, he would be around 90 to 95. He'd be really, really old at this point if he was still even alive at all. But we don't know. And that's the powerful thing about myths, is that when we don't have our own conclusions to really draw fully, we are pulled in even more. We're pulled in even more by that desire and longing to know. And at the same time, we don't ever want to know because that would spoil the myth. We're in love with the chase and the hunt. And so if you haven't checked out D.B. Cooper, Where Are You? By Netflix, I would highly recommend you go watch it. If you've never heard anything about the case, it'll be an incredible introduction to it. Even if you are familiar with it, there are certain things that I learned in watching this documentary that I didn't know. For example, I wasn't familiar with Robert Rackstraw being such a well thought out and considered suspect. I wasn't familiar with this French Canadian comic about this action hero known as Dan Cooper, which was the given name of the hijacker. There are all these new tidbits and bits and pieces of information that have opened my eyes up even more to the myth surrounding this guy the world knows as DB Cooper. And if you have not watched it on Netflix, I highly recommend that you go check it out. If you have been listening, thank you so much for listening in today. If you have been checking us out on YouTube or watching, if you're watching this on YouTube, let me know what you think. Even if you're listening to this on the radio, reach out to our social media channels. You can find me on Instagram at Trll Kennedy with no I, like I said, or at No Alter Egos on Instagram and Facebook. That's how you can contact the podcast. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, drop a comment. Let me know what your potential theories are for the DB Cooper mystery, because at least to me, I'm fascinated by it. And yes, cultural biases aside, we can think about how he'd be remembered if he wasn't a white guy that did it. But just the fact that he did successfully get away with it, it boggles my mind. And I don't think he'll ever be discovered. I don't think he's ever going to get caught or found out in terms of who was this guy or is this guy? And that is really crazy to me and also really kind of cool to me. So let me know what you think. Drop a comment in the comments section. Even if you're listening on the radio, look us up on YouTube. We're the No Alter Egos podcast. And this is Let's Doc About It by No Alter Egos, man. I'm really excited and blessed to have been able to share this story and this docu-series documentary with you guys over these past couple of weeks. I hope you check it out and let me know your thoughts on the mystery of DB Cooper. We're going to wrap up this episode, though, and hit you guys with our final thought for the day coming up next here on Let's Doc About It by No Alter Egos. So our final thought this week is actually inspired by some of the themes from this documentary. And that thought is, learn to see outside the color of your own biases. I think very often in life, and in fact, not even very often, but all the time, almost every single day of our lives, we view the world through our own perspectives and with our own biases. And that's only to be expected. We have our brains, we have our life experiences and memories, and those memories really do shape and color the way that we see people, see events, and that we generally experience life. But more often than not, we forget to leave those biases at the door when we are experiencing and interacting certain events and memories. We tend to think of ourselves as being completely unbiased, that somehow our version of the truth is the only version, and that couldn't be further from the truth. The truth of the matter is, everything that we do, myself included, everything that we experience and say, the way that we live, is influenced by our biases. So, how can we get rid of them? The truth is you can't. But you can learn to be actively aware of the fact that you have them, and in doing so, actively work to put them to the side and not allow them to color your perspective on things. Oftentimes, we do want the world to make sense. We do want things to be black and white. And so these things that get passed down to us culturally, usually in our homes by our parents, they make the world make a little more sense to us. However, if we can step away from those things that we have been taught, what we've been taught to expect of people, what we've been taught to expect of ourselves, we realize that the world, at least I know I have realized, that there is so much more of a rich tapestry in this world. When you step away from your biased perspective, you're able to see all the colors of the world, if you will, for what they truly are. And black and white just gets boring. We have to know and understand that our perspective is not the only one. And if we constantly only view others through the lens of our own judgment, as opposed to being as open-minded as possible when we approach others, then we shut ourselves off forever from the beauty of the human experience. If I were to look at someone from India and think that, oh, it's just crazy that you don't eat cows because they're sacred, then I would never come to understand what the cow meant to an Indian farmer several thousand years ago, and why Hinduism has held it in such high regard and esteem ever since. If I were to look at someone from another culture and think that their cultural trends and tendencies are wacko, don't get me wrong, there are some that at the end of the day, whether it's my perspective or not, I'm just not going to agree with. But if I shut myself off from that, then I shut myself off from learning a potential bit of hidden wisdom inside of that cultural thing. And it works both ways, because if the man from India can't look at me and see that I say, look, a cow, a piece of steak, a burger is a delicious thing, then we can find no common ground between each other. And I think that's the more important point that I'm getting at here, is that in order for us as a species to progress, we're going to have to learn to know and understand that our perspective isn't the only one, nor is it the right one most of the time. We have to learn and understand that everyone else's perspectives exist too. And in a way, they're just as valid, because your perspective and your experience does dictate your reality in this world. So my hope for you as you go through this week, having listened to this podcast now and hopefully a little more entertained and educated about this subject, is that you will learn to strip away those biases through which you view the world, that you will learn to be a more unbiased person, that you will learn to be more open to experiences in your life. And in doing so, you'll be a human being that contributes to the richness of this tapestry that we call planet Earth, our home. Thank you guys for being here. Go through the rest of this week. Have a more open mind and open eyes to view the beauty of the world as it stands in front of you. Take care of yourselves, and as always, God bless.
Looking in the mirror, I know I'm imperfect, just like everybody else I know. Most times I wish the world looked beneath the surface, but I guess that's how life goes. Had to learn to love myself this time around. Pop a bottle and then take a sip just because. Book a flight and then take a trip just because. Love myself just because.